Okay. So unfortunately, I had recorded this whole thing, and then only after I recorded it did it say, "Oh, you have to have a paid subscription to this thing." So that was all a waste. Okay. So happy to be with you guys. Thanks for the course, Professor. It was actually really awesome getting to study a topic that I'm very passionate about. Um, so I am looking forward to this presentation. Um, I think it'll be good. It's benefited me to study for it for sure. Okay, introduction. Okay, Christians throughout history have wrestled with an important question. How should believers relate to their nation? Some Christians argue that patriotism is dangerous because it can become nationalism or idolatry. Others believe that loving one's country is both natural and virtuous. This presentation argues that patriotism is legitimate and even good from a Christian worldview, provided that it remains properly ordered under the loyalty to Christ. Christian theology teaches that nations are real parts of God's providential order, that Christians should seek the good of their communities, and that love for one's nation can exist without replacing devotion to God. Okay, nations exist under God. Um, John Calvin says magistrates have a mandate from God, invested with divine authority. That's a very important quote. It really does portray Romans. We talked about that earlier in the course, what Romans has to say about politics. Um, that um, that the civil magistrate is uh, it's got a special authority by God. John Calvin, I don't agree with everything he's had to say about politics. Reading anything he did with Geneva, it's like pretty extreme stuff. Um, but this quote is definitely biblical. Um, the photo I chose for the slide here is American Progress. It's a very famous painting, um, but essentially it portrays this angel, the representative of God, not the representation of God, but a representative from God, um, guiding the American people, because the American people believed at the beginning of the nation, at the founding, that we had this duty to go ahead and conquer the nation to become one nation under God. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Christian concept of ordered loves. This is um, this is a really important concept going forward in this presentation. Um, Augustine says in his book, City of God, two cities have been formed by two loves, the earthly by love of self, the heavenly by love of God. We're going to talk about a quote similar to this later in the presentation by Augustine, but to sum this one up, um, well, basically, he's talking about obviously the ideal city of God in his book. I don't want to dive too much into um, what Augustine's book is, but essentially, here he is kind of getting at the idea that you know we have to have this order of loves. You can't just have everything be loved the same. God has to be priority. The reason I have a picture of JD Vance here is because he actually brought up this concept a couple months ago. It brought a lot of controversy and speculation, a renewed interest in this concept. He says, but there's this old school concept, and I think a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. He said that um, to Sean Hannity on Fox News. Um, but that's him expressing the concept of the Ordo Amoris, or the ordered loves. Ordo Amoris is a classical Latin term to describe that. Um, but it is a really important concept. Um, God must come first, but humans still have real responsibilities towards their families, communities, and nations. The early church theologian St. Augustine talked about that in the quote that I just mentioned. His point is that the ultimate dividing line in human history is what people love most. Patriotism is legitimate when it remains properly ordered under the love of God. Okay, this is a little bit of a shorter slide here. but it's just a quote from John Lehman. Christians live with dual citizenship, one in a temporal nation and another in the eternal kingdom of Christ. I actually talked about this in a class of mine recently. It was uh, last year, spring, and it's essentially this idea that we are living both on earth here in our earthly bodies in our corrupted world, um, and also we are citizens of heaven bought by the blood of Christ. Um, Really, it's interesting to think about because we are merely pilgrims here, but we are also citizens here, citizens that have to spread the Great Commission, spread the gospel, share the love of Christ with one another. Um, and so we are living with this dual citizenship, this tension. Um, and obviously, what we do here, it can be viewed by many as unimportant, especially with the popular pilgrim terminology. Um, that's, essentially just, I'll bear this world for a time and then I'll get to heaven. Um, that's not the point. The point is not just to bear it. The point is to thrive in it and to obey God in it. That's actually really the point, is to obey God in it. Um, and so what we do here impacts what we do for or what is done in the rest of eternity. Um, it's no small deal. We live here, um, chosen by God to live here in this place in this time, um, for our own specific mission. Um, this means Christians should care about their country, but they must never confuse national identity with their ultimate spiritual identity. Okay, this is a controversial slide. We have a photo here of two very controversial figures, the late Charlie Kirk and Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson here says patriotism, rightly developed, is a duty that falls under the fifth commandment. The fifth commandment is honor thy father and mother. I'll get back to that in a second. Charlie Kirk also says patriotism is not blind loyalty to the government, but fierce loyalty to the principles that make America great. So this slide is basically trying to point out that patriotism is not a bad thing. Um, we tend to believe that as Christians that for some reason patriotism is intrinsically bad somehow. Um, and I think that belief comes from, every Christian is a brother and a sister in the heavenly kingdom, and that is true. However, we also, like I just said, we were placed in this place and time for a reason. So we are to love our neighbors and we are to act towards the common good of, them and us and the nation. Um, so what Doug Wilson is trying to get at here is that he compares patriotism to loving one's family or hometown. It's an expression of gratitude and loyalty towards the community that shaped us. Um, and so I don't know how much what he's trying to say about honor thy father and mother being patriotism. I haven't looked too deeply into his views there. Um, but it is an interesting idea for sure. This slide is interesting as well. Um, Patriotism does not presuppose hatred. A lot of people tend to believe that if you are a American patriot, um, you are somehow racist, bigoted, um, et cetera, et cetera. And we can say that about the left if we can call them patriots. We can assume a lot of bad things about them as well if they're acting towards a love of their idea of America. Chesterton puts it this way: "My country, right or wrong, is a thing no patriot would think of saying. It is like saying my mother, drunk or sober." Um, the idea he's trying to get across here is that our country is not infallible. We ought not treat it that way. Um, it's, the my mother drunk or sober phrase is just basically it's the idea of like, okay, well, my mom, she's drunk, but she's still my mom. She's sober, she's still my mom. It's this passive um concept. So Chesterton is pointing out here that we are not to be passive but active in recognizing the sins of our own country. So patriotism does not presuppose hatred. Um, to be a patriot, you do not have to hate your country. You do not have to hate, or sorry, that obviously you don't have to hate your country. That's antithetical to patriotism. Um, but patriotism does not presuppose the hatred of people who live in that country. Um, Chesterton says it is a thing no patriot would think of saying. Um, so no patriot would think of, um, just being passive towards the hatred developing in their country. Um, anyways, I just think that this is an important point. Christian thinkers distinguish between healthy patriotism and aggressive nationalism. This distinction allows Christians to love their nation while still recognizing the dignity and value of other nations. Okay, Richard Mouw says that patriotism is a form of gratitude for the political community that has nurtured us. Though this political community tends to be comprised of local and federal politicians, a political community, rightly understood, can also involve a family, a congregation, or a workplace. Um, so, this idea of patriotism as gratitude is, in my mind, very fundamental to the idea of patriotism. Um, because if you're not grateful for something, then patriotism is what is it? It's this nebulous concept that nobody really knows what it is if you're not grateful for something. Um, I'm going to talk about culture in a little bit, but one thing that you can be grateful for is culture, common culture. I'm grateful for baseball games and hot dogs on a hot summer day. Um, and I am grateful that that political community, whether it be politicians, local political community, family, um, workplace, uh, baseball teams. They handed these traditions down to us, and we can be grateful for that. We can be grateful for the laws that have been put in place by our politicians. We can be grateful for the community fostered by grandparents. And there's a plethora of other examples there. Okay. C.S. Lewis says, love for one's country means chiefly love for a people who have a good deal in common with oneself. Um, So, another thing about patriotism is that you have to have a shared culture with the people around you. Um, um, any nation, what is a nation? That's the question. Um, a nation is it has to have a culture, otherwise you have people looking around at each other, um, thinking each other is stupid. You have different worldviews, you have different ideas, you have different languages, um, and those things divide people. You see that in Babel when God confuses their languages. They're all working towards this goal. God confuses their languages and they all look around, it becomes chaos and they split. Um, that is sort of what I am trying to illustrate here. Um, you need some sort of shared culture, shared language, um, shared experience to be able to be a patriotic individual or to be patriotic towards um, the nation that you live in. Um, so you need to be able to have these things. And this is not an anti-immigration argument. This is not an anti um, diversity argument. This is just saying that in order to have a nation, you need to have um, a lot of shared things. And the more diversity you have, frankly, the more fractured the nation tends to become. Okay, when patriotism becomes idolatry. C.S. Lewis again, he says, this love, which is patriotism, becomes a demon when it becomes a god. And that's interesting because he's not just saying that patriotism becomes this thing that you can sweep under the rug when it becomes your God. It becomes a demon when it becomes a God. And what he means by a God is an idol. Um, so if you take that order of loves that we were talking about earlier, and apply it to this situation, it's as if you're putting the nation above God in that order. Um, C.S. Lewis is saying that when you do that, it becomes a demon. Um, all kinds of nations fall corrupt because of their order of affections. Um, and using that phrase demon is actually very significant because um, it's not a passive thing. It's something that's going to come destroy you. So when you're patriotic about the wrong things, the example here is, the Confederate flag. When you're patriotic about, and I recognize the Civil War is more complicated than that, but I'm just going to run with the mainstream takeaway from the Civil War. Um, when you idolize an idea above God, that in this situation is slavery, um, it becomes a demon, it becomes a poison, it becomes a rot, a cancer within your country. Patriotism is bad when loves become disordered, when the love of country becomes greater than the love of God. Okay. In other words, patriotism becomes destructive when the nation replaces God as its highest authority. Okay, the limits of earthly nations, just going to skim over this one pretty quick. Augustine, again in City of God, says the earthly city glorifies in itself, the heavenly city glorifies or glories in the Lord. Sorry, my throat is dry. Yeah, so this is kind of important. I think I mentioned this verse earlier. I don't know if it was the first recording or if I did it in this one. Um, but the Bible says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." Um, Augustine here is kind of saying like the nation that is self-indulgent, self-loving, um, it's just got a puffed up chest. Um, that is the earthly city. The heavenly city is saying not how great I am, but how great God is. Um, honestly, Augustine is a very fascinating read, The City of God, and Confessions. Um, he's a very emotionally charged author, especially for that time period. Um, and so the way he talks about things like this, is just very striking. Um, he's talking about glorying in the Lord, and that is the heavenly nation that glories in the Lord. Um, so that's a very important point. Christian theology also reminds us that no earthly nation is permanent. This perspective protects Christians from turning their nation into an ultimate source of identity. Okay. Seeking the good of one's own nation. Christian patriotism put into practice looks not dissimilar to our own idea of Christianity. If we commit ourselves to loving God and neighbor, we are acting in a patriotic way. And those two things are foundational to the Christian faith. Loving God and neighbor. Those are things that Christ Himself, God Himself, commands. Um, we are acting in a patriotic way. However, it is not limited to this only. Patriotism can look like the pursuit of justice in one's own government, or it can look like staying home and financially supporting the country. So this can look like being a politician. You run for office because you are trying to um, improve the nation around you because you love the people, because you love the nation, because you want to improve the life of not only yourself but your neighbors too, for the glory of God. And all throughout this entire presentation, what I want to do is be orienting. Um, I want to be orienting everything towards God here, not patriotism. Christian patriotism at its foundation is oriented towards God, not just towards the country. Um, or it can look like staying home and financially supporting the country. Um, you as a patriot, it's like supporting missionaries, right? Like you, in a way, are complicit, if that's the right word to use, in sharing the gospel over in other countries, or as um, getting certain people in office, things like that. Okay, recognizing the authority of Christ. The main idea here is that Christ remains the highest authority. Possibly the most foundational thing to Christian patriotism is the recognition of Christ's final authority. He holds the gavel, and nothing, even politically, slips through his fingers unnoticed. You cannot have a good and flourishing nation without the recognition at the highest and most absolute level of the lordship of Jesus Christ. Okay, this is important. I think in American Christianity in particular, we tend to um, again, have a very worldwide idea of um, brothers and sisters and of our religion. In other words, we're anti-nationalists. We don't like to be focused on home, because what it does is elevates the people in that home above people across the globe. And I think what we tend to believe is that um, we are somehow elevating the value of American citizens, of our fellow neighbors, as greater than the value of a Chinese believer. And that's not what we're doing. We're just saying we have a higher focus on the people here at home because this is the place that God put us. Um, where I was going with that is religious pluralism. Um, because we have this, worldwide mindset, not only that, um, we tend to, I think, embrace the idea that diversity is this amazing thing, and thus that religious pluralism is this amazing thing. Um, Religious pluralism is really bad, actually. We can have compassion towards a Muslim, towards a Hindu, towards a Jew, towards um, a Mormon. We can have compassion towards those people, and we can love them with the love of Christ. But um, this idea that having a diversity of religions, or that even within a country, that is somehow a good thing, is absolutely ridiculous in my opinion. Um, because really what that does is, in the public schools, for example, it's throwing your kids into a melting pot of worldviews and forcing them to figure it out, spending 9 hours a day with all these different worldviews. Meanwhile, they have a couple hours with you in the evening, in a Christian worldview. And it's like, yeah, that's just not a good thing for the kids. And that's just one example of a million as to why religious pluralism is not a good thing. Um, so recognizing the lordship of Christ at the highest level, at you know, the three branches of government, if those branches recognized Christ as the Lord of all creation, the one who died for our sins, if they recognized him like that, man, what a different country we would have, and how that would affect our legislation and everything, is just so huge. Okay. um, Avoiding two extremes. This is another idea that I'm very passionate about. I learned about this from Aristotle, um, in a intro to philosophy class that I took at a community college here in town. Um, and I've just been passionate about it ever since. That was several years ago now. But Aristotle says it is admitted that moderation and the mean are best, and therefore will clearly be best to possess the gifts of fortune in moderation. For in that condition of life, men are most ready to follow the rational principle. Okay. So we have the virtue vice continuum here, where virtue is in the middle. Vice is on either side. You don't want to fall off either side of the horse. Um, just taking this top one, for example, integrity. On the one hand, you have taken that to its extreme, legalism, taking it to its other extreme, corruption. That's a very vague answer. So let's look at love. On the one hand, you have selfishness. On the other hand, you have enablement. I mean, you can think of that as um, like somebody who's really struggling with a weight issue and you just keep giving them the food. That would be enablement. Um, Whereas on the other hand of that, if you want to hog all of the McDonald's and you're not giving any of it to your wife and kids, that's selfish. Um, so in this scenario, what we want to talk about is rejecting both this nationalism, this man-centered nationalism, where it's like, um, America is the best. We never go wrong. We're infallible. We want to reject that because that's not good. Um, on the other side, we don't want to fall into anti-patriotism where we hate our country and hate everything about it and think that there's no good in it, that the culture is not valuable, things like that. Okay, conclusion. Thanks for sticking with me. This has been long, I think. Um, Patriotism is not about absolute trust and authority, nor is it about an undying and unconditional love for your country. Rather, it is a clear expression of love for neighbor and love for God. This is also a mission. Pursue the common good for all men in your political communities. Um, all right, and then I also want to do the bibliography here. You can look at all of my sources here. I don't think I missed any. Um, Anyways, thank you a lot, Professor, for doing this class. This has been very impactful for me. Just a really good time. So, thanks a lot.